We started the week with 287 public forum teams, and now I present to you the final two teams who will debate the resolution on balance, the benefits of United States participation in the North American Free Trade Agreement outweigh the consequences. Representing the pro side is team number N39 speaking second. And representing the con side is team number N290 speaking first. Good luck and congratulations to both of our teams.
All right. So I think I should give some thank yous. First, I'd like to thank this kid, Rajesh, who gave me $100 to be the first thank you in this speech. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you. That was actually a lie, but you guys laughed, so that means NAFTA sucks, and you should vote for us. But before we begin, Devesh and I want to congratulate Chris and Eden for making it here. The four of us have always had the best rounds, and I think I speak for the community as a whole when we say we can't think of better opponents, more importantly, better role models for this activity than the two of you. But a few other thank yous are in order. First, we'd like to thank Mr. J. Scott One, Mr. Chris McDonald, and the National Speech and Debate Association for coordinating this event, which means so much to us. We'd be remiss without expressing our gratitude to the Arthur N. Roop Foundation and the Broward County Schools, whose local sponsors single-handedly make this incredible tournament possible. Second, we'd like to personally thank those who helped us reach this stage. To our coach and school advisor, Jasmine Liu and Thomas Thompson, thank you for working to build our program from the ground up in just a few short years. To our teammates, past and present, Lucas, Arnav, Maggie, Apoorv, Rithvik, Keshav, Stephen, and Neha, you guys are our family. To our friends from all over the country, from Texas to New Jersey, you guys inspire us to be better competitors and people. I love you, Jasper, Kelly, and Brian. Just you three. And to the judges and coaches from other schools who helped us, a couple of kids coming from a program that hardly existed just a couple years ago, we owe you all of our success and then some. Lastly, some personal thank yous. I have to thank the figure that raised me and taught me everything I needed to know about growing through life. They opened my eyes to the world and exposed me to new ideas and creativity I never would have been able to experience before. So thank you, Kanye West. Yeah. Also, my parents, but they're a small part. To Max Wu, our former teammate and now coach, even though you try to impose your communist agenda on our Uber drivers and borrowed 3 plants from our hotel lobby, we love you, both in your genius and silliness. Never change. And finally, I have to thank my partner, Devesh. You've been my best friend and the best partner I could ever have asked for this past year. I know there's a lot that's been gone between us, primarily your showering habits, but you've always had my back and been the most reliable friend I have. You make me want to be a better debater and force me to reach heights of competitive ability I never thought were possible for myself. Not a single day goes by that I don't think about what happened on TOCs on April 30th, and I'm sorry, but I want you to know this means everything to me, and I would not want to debate this round with anyone else. All right, that was a lot, so let's get to it. For the last time ever, Devesh and I negate the resolution. Our sole contention is halting Mexico's development. Prior to NAFTA, Mexico was on a path to sustainable long-term development. As Mark Wiesbro, director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research 14 explains, Mexico's program of planned industrial development, domestic enterprise, and rigid social programs brought record levels of growth in the years before NAFTA. From 1960 to 80, Mexico's GDP per capita doubled, amounting to huge increases in living standards for the vast majority of Mexicans. If the country had continued to grow at this rate, as nations like South Korea did, it would be living in European standards today. Simultaneously, Mexico used a gradual approach to open itself to the world market while protecting national industries. As Cordova Brookings 03 explains, following the 1982 debt crisis, Mexico began gradually liberalizing its economy, eventually eliminating trade licenses and simplifying tariffs. During this period, the Library of Congress finds that Mexico diversified its exports, moved towards self-sufficiency in food and most consumer goods, and expanded domestic production. Unfortunately, NAFTA brought this development to a halt, plunging Mexico into the global economy headfirst with no regulation or protection of domestic industry. As Wiesper writes, NAFTA brought Mexico's industrial and developmental policies to an end, enshrining rapidly deregulated trade and investment in a binding agreement. Specifically, Rocha of the Institute for Policy Studies 14 writes that under NAFTA, corporations were granted the legal power to sue the Mexican government whenever it passed programs that could interfere with corporate profits. This resulted in a chilling effect where the Mexican government was effectively blackmailed out of passing further reforms that served the public interest. Instead, NAFTA reversed progress and electrocuted the Mexican economy in two ways. The first is destroying domestic industry. Without any domestic regulation, NAFTA's rapid shift to trade allowed American multinational corporations to quickly take over Mexico's key industries, destroying jobs for the poor and working class. As Rocha writes, NAFTA has unequivocally been a net job destroyer for Mexico, as companies like Walmart have displaced scores of smaller businesses, causing more than 600,000 companies to go bankrupt during the current administration alone. For example, in the agricultural sector, Wiesper finds roughly 5 million permanent farm jobs were lost due to agricultural monopolies. Thus, he concludes the Mexican unemployment rate has averaged roughly 5% under NAFTA, whereas in the pre-NAFTA age, it was only 3%. Second is creating financial dependency. As Wiesper explains, because Mexican institutions were still developing when NAFTA was enacted, the deal increasingly tied the country to American investment, meaning any recession would hit Mexico harder, as the U.S. would pull all its money out of the market. Indeed, financial crises in '94, '01, and '08 all had a more severe impact on Mexico than any other country in the region. Reuters 17 verifies that Mexican dependence on America's economy pushed an additional 5 million people into poverty during the '08 recession alone. Worst of all, this dependence means that shocks in the prices of basic goods, which used to be stable, are now highly volatile. Laura Carlson of New York Times 17 finds that under NAFTA, Mexican consumers now pay more for food in general, while price spikes on the international market have pushed millions of the poor into starvation. For these two reasons, Professor Danny Roderick of Harvard University 17 concludes, almost all of the world's developing country success stories, China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, avoided rapid globalization and instead used a gradual approach to liberalization, with the government playing an active role in restructuring the economy and buffering it against volatile markets. Wiesper furthers that since 2000, Mexico's economy has grown at less than half the rate as the rest of Latin America, while most of its countries have implemented developmental policies that cut the overall rate of poverty in Latin America by 1/3, Mexico has made no progress whatsoever. In other words, given Mexico's roughly 60 million people under the poverty line, NAFTA prevented the country from lifting tens of millions of people into the middle class. It's for these reasons that we strongly negate the resolution. Thank you.
So, like Ishan, before we get started, we'd also like to extend some appreciation to a handful of people who are integral to our success at this tournament and over the past 4 years of our career. First, to our opponents for always motivating us to be better and always allowing us to have competitive rounds. Let's hope we were better this round. Next, to the NSDA for creating this event and the Arthur N. Roop Foundation for sponsoring this event so that we would have the ability to compete on this stage. And then next, we would like to thank the Broward Initiative, Broward County Schools, the Broward School Board, Superintendent Runcie, and our principal, Ms. Kefford, who made this all possible and continue to work so thousands more kids across the country are able to find their voices like Eden and I have. Next, to my parents and my 2 sisters for your constant love, emotional, and financial, that's key, support to be able to send me all over the country every weekend to participate in this activity. A special shout out also goes to my mother, who has worked tirelessly before every tournament to make sure that we always had a flight on time or food to eat when we were too busy to care for ourselves. Next, to Miss McGraw. Second to my mother, Miss McGraw is by far the hardest working person I've ever met. In 6 years, she took a team that no one had ever heard of and turned it into a team with national recognition with literally no one else but herself, all the while experiencing hardship that would have discouraged anyone else from continuing on. Next, to John Williamson. While your knowledge helped us so much last year, it was your open heart and constant encouragement which helped us the most. Next, to everyone who has made this activity so enjoyable for me. All of my camp lab mates, the GHC, the Goat Squad, La Cucaracha, the Flabby Alliance, and everyone around the South Florida area and all of my teammates, you made me want to continue my participation even during times when I thought it would be too overwhelming. Next to Eden. It would be an understatement to say that over the past 4 years, there has been someone else that has had a bigger impact on my life, inside, debate, and out. You are not only an inspiration to me, but to all women debaters across the country who can look to you as a model of strength and perseverance in an event that constantly isolates them. This isn't the first time you are one woman amidst 3 male debaters in a debate round, but you never let this stop you from being the most powerful person in the room. I'm so grateful to call you my partner and my friend. Lastly, to the person who has had the most impact on our success this year, I didn't forget you this time. Thank you to Matt Fang. You are by far the sweetest, smartest, and most humble person I have ever met, all the while maintaining a level of integrity that I have not seen in any single person ever. I could go on and on. Thank you for your countless hours of discussions of arguments and insight into literally everything from debate to relationships to basketball. But more importantly, thank you for being one of my best friends. I know I can speak for Eden and I when we both say that we love you immeasurably. Okay, let's get started. Enough sappy. Are all the judges ready? Cool. We believe that the resolution should be evaluated on 2 dimensions. First, the implications of continuing American involvement in NAFTA, and second, the impact that American participation in NAFTA has already brought the region. Our first contention is what American participation will continue to bring. President Trump has turned away from multilateral institutions since taking power and has demonstrated to resolve and following through on campaign promises. For instance, he has withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, suspended military exercises with South Korea, and has long threatened to leave NAFTA. These actions jeopardize American relations with our closest allies and risk plunging the world into disarray, which would only allow rival powers like China to fill the void in global leadership that the United States has abdicated. Global Americans, a think tank on Latin American issues with support from the Ford Foundation 17, writes that if the United States pulled out of NAFTA, it would leave a large economic vacuum that China could fill. This is problematic as they continue that a retreat by the United States is a serious risk to American influence. They add that China sees economic influence as eventually leading to diplomatic influence. The expansion of Chinese influence as a global leader would be disastrous, as they have horrible human rights records and emphasize letting countries govern themselves, which is just a euphemism for turning a blind eye to authoritarianism. Indeed, Deal 17 of the Washington Post argues that Chinese global leadership would significantly curtail individual freedoms and encouraging cracking down on political dissidents. Our second contention is what NAFTA has already done for the region. In 1994, the Mexican economy plunged into a recession because of investor fears and political violence. NAFTA prevented a protracted Mexican recession in 3 ways, and the first by enabling export-oriented growth. Because exports are driven by demand in other countries, they are resilient in times of recession in the home country. When Mexico, but not the US, experienced economic instability, exports remained stable. Lustig 17 empirically finds that Mexico's economic recovery began in 1995 with the decline in GDP that year, followed by 5.1% growth in 1996. The engine of Mexico's recovery, He 17 of 538, specifies that Mexican exports more than quadrupled since NAFTA went into effect. Comparatively, Burfisher 01 of the Journal of Public Economic Perspectives concludes that NAFTA greatly reduced the harms the peso crisis would have otherwise had, concluding that without it, Mexican exports would have fallen 52% more. Second is by boosting investor confidence. Burfisher again writes that NAFTA's promise of sustained official economic relations reassured investors about the prospects for recovery and growth of the Mexican economy in the aftermath of the peso crisis. Lustig 97 of Brookings noted that NAFTA was crucial for Mexico's economic recovery by encouraging exports and foreign direct investment, quantifying that FDI in Mexico would have been 40% lower without NAFTA. Because FDI is long-term capital investment, Tello 17 of the ERC explains that FDI is tied to regional long-term economic resilience. Third is by incentivizing a US bailout. If the US had left Mexico to face its crisis alone, America would have experienced its own domestic financial crisis from the close linkages forged by NAFTA. Consequently, Lacuna 99 of the International Journal of World Peace emphasizes that there is no doubt that Mexico's recuperation was due to the United States, which had no choice but to help Mexico or suffer economic chaos itself. Additionally, Humphrey of Utah in 2000 documents that as the peso value plummeted, devaluation hurt investors and the legitimacy of NAFTA itself. President Bill Clinton could not afford inaction and jeopardize the success of a landmark trade deal. Instead, the US bailed out Mexico, lending billions of dollars and stifling the crisis. Mexico's GDP during the crisis reflected a disastrous economic downfall. Yet a year later, Mexico recuperated thanks to the economic support of NAFTA. The impact is preventing a peso piñata. William Orme, in his 1998 book, writes that NAFTA's kept the peso's slide from accelerating into a free fall. And absent NAFTA, Mexico's crash would have been instantaneous and far more severe. Puig in 2007 furthers that the bailout left Mexico much better off than its counterparts who had experienced similar crises without U.S. support, like Argentina, whose own peso crisis more than doubled the country's poverty rate. Vasquez O2 of Cato emphasizes that the 1995 bailout of Mexico by restoring confidence and enabling quick economic recovery stemmed the outbreak of a global financial crisis. Thus, we affirm.
You good?
Yep.
Yeah. So in 1995, when Bill Clinton proposed the bailout for the U.S., did he ever use the word NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, or anything similar?
It doesn't matter what the semantics are, right? We say that because
really?
of the
'Cause
close
that's your
linkages.
case.
No. It doesn't matter what the president says, right? Because they say things that they don't necessarily are
Okay,
doing.
so the
right,
administration.
with the
Sure.
things in mind, right? Our evidence says that because of the close linkages that were
Yeah.
only forged because of NAFTA,
Okay.
if Mexico,
Yeah,
can you please let me finish?
I understand what your evidence says.
If
My
Mexico
question-
slid under because of the close linkages forged by NAFTA, the U.S. would have suffered the same economic crisis.
So
they didn't want to.
I
Can I ask you a
understand.
question?
No, this is really important because you dodged what I was trying to say, right? So I understand what your evidence talks about when they are analyzing what you wanted to say. But if you look at what the administration went out and said, the only
They didn't write
reasons-
the evidence with my argument
Okay,
in
the
mind. They
only
wrote
thing
it
the White
20
House
years
said,
ago. Can
if
I
you
ask
look
you
to
a question?
reality, the only thing the White House said was that they wanted to prevent illegal aliens from spilling across the border, and they want to prevent a global crisis.
Yes,
If your
a
impact
global
is so
crisis
big-
that would have only
Yes.
started because of the close linkages
Yes.
forged by NAFTA.
Okay,
That
so
is
that's
what
perfect.
the evidence
That's
says.
perfect.
It's, you're just coming up here and just like saying some
The
random.
bigger
Can I
your
ask you a
impact
question?
is, the more reason the U.S. has to give the bailout. If a global crisis is going to happen, or if other countries are going to be affected, then NAFTA doesn't matter because the U.S. has an inherent reason to stop that from
The
happening.
reason why the global economic crisis would have happened
It's
is the
not because of
only
NAFTA.
reason is because of NAFTA,
That's
right?
so naive.
No.
Like
the United
before
States
that-
was
okay.
not closely linked
Sure.
to Mexico as much as it was post
Okay, so
NAFTA.
if that's
Can
true,
I please ask
okay,
a question?
one last thing.
No,
If that's true,
You've had three
why did the
things.
U.S. bail out
It's been half a
Mexico
crossfire.
in 1982 when we did not have NAFTA?
It took them a lot longer to bail them out. And also the recovery because of that, because of the lack of investment and the lack of exports, also
But-
took a lot longer, right? The recovery in
Okay, so you're
1982 took
Okay, sure.
tons of years.
So
and
the-
in
so the
1995,
bailout
it
doesn't
only
trigger
took
your
1
offense,
year.
only
Can
the
I
FDI
please-
does.
Can I please have
Yeah,
one
sure.
question? Okay, cool. So you say that 600 companies went bankrupt during the last administration.
600,000.
Yeah, so the American evidence that gets that number, when it looks to the actual article that was posted in Mexico, why does it say that the 600,000 companies went out of
If you don't
went
like
out
that
of
evidence, I can read another piece of evidence.
No, but why did those 600,000 specifically go
I would
bankrupt?
rather just engage with the warrant than like talk about useless numbers, right? Like
Okay,
I
but
personally don't know the answer to that.
If your impact is only about those useless numbers, then
No,
how are you
like
gaining
if you don't like
impact
that number, I can read another one. I personally don't know the answer to your question. Maybe you do, but
Yeah,
like
so it
I
says
don't know
that
why
the
it matters.
administration would refuse to give tax credits to these companies, so they had to go under. It wasn't
Okay.
at all attributable to NAFTA. You can have a question.
Sure. So when you talk about how we have to look towards things that would happen if we pulled out right now, let's say the resolution was the consequences of being inside high school, or the benefits outweigh the consequences of being in high school. Would I have to defend dropping out of high school right now, or never going to high school in the first place?
No, yeah, you would have to defend the continued participation of you being in high school because those benefits only come with you being in high school.
Okay, so as long as I was in high school, but
No.
why would I have to,
If
like,
you
would I
can-
have to drop out?
It's overtime.
Okay.
Like,
You guys ready? Chris and Eddie. Yeah. Ishan? All right, so Ishan got most of the thank yous out of the way in his own special way, but I'm just gonna get to a couple of specifics personal to myself. So first of all, I have to thank my friends and family, the people who are watching this event live from different states and different parts of the country. So obviously, Mom, Dad, Ishan, Durga, the whole gang, I love all of you guys. Like, thank you so much for tuning in and for supporting me in this activity this whole time. A lot of people who know me well know that this activity means a lot to me. I've been doing it for a long time. It's where I found a lot of my friends, and it's where I found my voice. And so, again, I really have to thank you guys for giving me that support. The only other thank yous I have are obviously to Ishan for coming into my life this year as my partner and coming from, like an aspiring JV debater to being on the national stage in less than 1 year. Like, that's crazy. That's incredible, and you improved on your own. So I have to give you a huge props for the most improvement I've ever seen in any person at all. And then the final person I have, yeah, can you guys clap again? I cut you off. And then the final person I have to thank, and I promised them I would thank them, is my old coach. He coached me way back in like 8th grade, and his name is Stephen Brooks. And he was the person who basically taught me how to talk and how to stop relying on ideas and numbers and facts and statistics and start relying on my voice and just the passion and the ideas I have. Logic, right? That's why I don't speak with a computer in front of me. I speak with paper, and that's why in some rounds I speak without paper at all, because he taught me that and he forced that down my throat, and now I do it. And I appreciate him a lot for that. Yeah, sorry, again, I didn't write that out. It wasn't that clear, but thank you all anyways. All right, let's do it. You guys ready? Let's start the time now. The thesis of our case is that while trade might be a good idea, equal rules for unequal players create unequal outcomes. Our argument is that when the US entered into NAFTA, when US entered into NAFTA, Mexico was gradually liberalizing its economy already, opening itself up to the world economy. But NAFTA took away all of the regulations and sped up the pace of trade so that Mexico could not acclimate to the trade that was already happening, causing their economy to go into free fall and destroying the livelihoods of the poor in the country. Let's talk about their framework. They tell you that we should look at continued participation and the impacts of participation in the past. But as Ishan points out in Crossfire, if the resolution was the benefits of a college education outweigh the harms, we shouldn't be saying that a current college-educated student should drop out. It's that they never should have gone to college. That's why the resolution doesn't use the word continued, for example, which is why we should look to what a world where Mexico never went into NAFTA really looks like. Let's deal with their first contention. They tell you that if Trump pulled out of NAFTA, bad things would happen. We say two things. First, we say that, again, this isn't topical because we're talking about a world where the US did not sign on to NAFTA and we stayed with the gradual increase in trade that was happening beforehand. But the second big problem with this argument is that it misses the mark on Trump's current policy. According to The Hill in 2017, Trump actually wants to renegotiate NAFTA at best. He's not going to pull out because there's far too much pressure in the government. So you're never going to be seeing this scenario materialize, which just means we should focus on the far more probable scenario where the US never signed on to NAFTA and we saw Mexico gradually developing. Let's deal with their second contention about the benefits of NAFTA. They talk about this 94 recession that was prevented by NAFTA, and they give you 3 reasons why. The first reason they give you is that trade increased as a consequence of NAFTA. But according to Professor Maunder of Harvard University in 2016, economists are largely in agreement that with or without NAFTA, Mexico and the US would have the same amount of trade virtually today, because Mexico was already opening itself up to the world economy and lowering tariffs. The difference is that A, that trade increase would have happened a lot more gradually, so Mexico could build itself up. But B, it would have had regulation, so America couldn't buy up Mexican land, speculate on their markets, and push the poor into starvation and poverty. Then there's second warrant here. They talk about how foreign investment cushioned the impact of this recession. But this argument is ahistoric because even before NAFTA, Nguyen of the University of Houston finds that from 1982 to 1993, that decade, Mexico was already #1 in Latin America in terms of development. Because what they lacked in foreign investment, they had in domestic investment and domestic enterprise. But NAFTA stripped that away from them, which on net pushed them to where today they are 18th out of 20 in Latin America. You can see that they've fallen off. But the second overall response to this comes from the Center for Policy Studies in 2015, which finds that there was an increase in FDI, but there was a 5 times increase in volatile investment after NAFTA. This is things that went into speculating on their stocks and buying up their land, which actually increased the odds of a recession. That's why every recession, 94, 01, 08, all hit Mexico harder than the rest of Latin America, which used the gradual path. Finally, they talk about how the US bailed Mexico out, but there are two problems with this. The first of which is that they can predict somehow that this recession would have led to a global crisis, then by that same logic, America has an interest in preventing a global crisis. They're going to come up and say that it only would have led to a global crisis under NAFTA, but then that's the reason to not have NAFTA, so we never risk a global crisis. But the second overall response to this is that the reason Clinton bailed them out is because they were south of the border. That's what he said. We're going to bail out countries that are nearby because we don't want illegal immigrants fleeing there. That's why, for example, America didn't bail out Chile, even though we did have a free trade agreement with them, but we did bail out Mexico in '82 when we didn't have a free trade agreement with them. Finally, the reason you turn this argument against their side is because Neely of Harvard University finds in 1997 that the reason this recession started in the first place is because NAFTA made Mexico dependent on United States investment. Then, 1 year later, when political events occurred in Mexico, they were able to pull all of that money out of the market, dropping the peso's value by 50%. But without NAFTA, that dependency wouldn't exist. They further that if NAFTA didn't exist, Mexico could have stopped the recession without American bailouts on its own. Thus, we're very proud to negate.
First, I want to thank all of Chris's thanks and extend some of my own. First, to Ima, Abba, Buggy, and Dandun. I love you all immeasurably, and I'm so grateful for the opportunities you've empowered me to find through this activity and the unconditional support you've provided along the way. To the Manatee District for hosting and running such an exceptional tournament. I feel so lucky to be able to take the stage in my own district, where I grew up with my family and friends in the audience. I am so thankful for the Florida circuit, specifically Natalie, Nova Debate, Cypress, St. Thomas, Sharon, and Bo for being such good friends to me. To Sunny for all of your help during this tournament and always for being the best friend I could ask for always supporting me and believing in me. This activity gave me a lot of great things, but one of the best things it gave me is you. To the rest of our friends around the circuit, Apex FFK, and everyone else, thank you for all of your help and love. To Mr. Williamson for all the fruit snacks and driving tips, and everything else. They didn't help that much, I still stuck at driving. To Miss McGraw, Eduardo, James, and Aves, to the rest of Falcon Speech and Debate, I remember being a freshman when getting to the second day at district seemed to be an impossibility, and when breaking at a tournament like this one seemed to be a distant, unattainable dream. You make dreams come true. Thank you for making this happen. To Matt, there's nothing I can say here that will be enough to make up for everything that you've done for us. When we didn't have a coach, you believed in us. You volunteered your time for us. You're not only brilliant, you're the smartest and kindest person I know, and I will never forget your generosity. To Chris, this has been the most amazing ride, and I could not have asked for a better partner or a better friend to end my career with. I'm so proud of us, and I'm so thankful for the chance to have gotten to know you through this activity and to gain all the lessons that we've learned together. Lastly, I want to add, it's been heartening to hear the discussions that have recently started regarding marginalization in this community, but I want to say that it's important to focus not only on eliminating overt forms of marginalization, but also on the implicit discrimination that is so pervasive in debate. And in a positive attempt to dismantle systemic discrimination, we often overlook that systems are made up of people and that individual behaviors comprise the larger trend that we see. How many times have you experienced or witnessed marginalization or have yourself silenced a perceptually disadvantaged person in competition? Judges, when you explain your decisions, do you look only to the boys in the room? Competitors, do you actively include women and students from small programs out of your rounds? This activity gives you a voice. Use it to better the world and the communities you're a part of. We are both symptoms and drivers of the dislocation that we see. To all the girls watching, believe in yourself. To everyone else, things are changing, and it starts with you. So when everyone's ready, it'll start on their case. Our second contention will be the first thing you evaluate in this round. This is because prolonging a recession precludes the ability for a country to gradually develop independently. Even if their arguments are true that in Mexico, booms, it had the ability to develop, it doesn't mean that in bust they can still develop. This is because public spending and investment shrink during recessions and make spending towards development virtually non-existent, which is why in Argentina, which experienced a peso crisis but no bailout because it did not have linkages to the US like Mexico had with NAFTA, it experienced incredibly volatile and near zero growth, comparatively lower than that of Mexico's. Start on their first contention. Their narrative is both counterintuitive and counterfactual. Their Wisebro evidence says that Mexico was experiencing record levels of growth. It was in 1960 to 80, before NAFTA and before liberalization started. But even that was seriously unsustainable. This is important because it proves that NAFTA was not the main reason for Mexico's slowing of growth. It was a necessary move away from protectionism or the gradualism that they talk about. Then they say that Mexico experienced record levels of growth. But in his book about NAFTA, Orme of UT writes that GDP growth seen in the 90s would have been difficult to sustain absent NAFTA. This is because Salinas needed the efforts to lock in the momentum of liberalization because he faced significant opposition. Specifically, he finds that it would have been far more difficult for a future Mexican government to pursue economic integration had NAFTA been rejected. Then they talk about ISDS and corporations causing a chilling effect. But Gertz 18 of Brookings finds that in light of the current impasse, there's a real possibility that NAFTA's investment rules will be scrapped into NAFTA 2.0, either by parties formally agreeing to exclude the stipulation altogether or by including an opt-out clause that all countries would take, meaning that in either case, this warrant would no longer apply. Then on the impact level, they tell you 600,000 companies went bankrupt, but Milenio finds that this was due to a lack of small business credits in Mexico, which the Nieto administration ended up reinstating. But then they tell you that people were displaced in the agricultural sector. Liederman finds that NAFTA actually included stipulations which would have allowed Mexico to put in place tariffs to prevent this from happening, but they just chose not to do so, which means that this problem is a fault of Mexican government, the Mexican government failing, not a fault of American participation within NAFTA. But even so, we would say this is an on-net benefit. This is because they're implicitly conceding that food prices in Mexico have decreased. This is the case because Mexican farmers, if Mexican farmers are losing their jobs, it means they can no longer profitably work. This necessarily means that prices have gone down because there's no way these farmers would be out of work if they could sell their produce at the same price as American farmers. We therefore outweigh in two ways. First, on scope. Price reductions massively benefit our larger section of the Mexican population, but second on magnitude, price reductions help those in poverty. Even if wages haven't increased, lower wages still means that every dollar gets stretched farther. Yes, farmers might be unemployed as well, but we say that lower prices benefit those in poverty and unemployed across Mexico. Lastly, when they talk about the severity of recessions and the frequency of recessions, we would say that the frequency and severity of recessions is about the same as it was before. That's because Caro finds that actually having the NAFTA, because it increased investor confidence in terms of a long-term trade relationship with Mexico, decreased volatility of the Mexican economy by 40%, so their argument is empirically false. But second, I would say the reason why Mexico was hit the hardest is because it's one of the most trade liberalized countries in the world. Mexico has free trade agreements with 46 countries, and only one of those is the United States, meaning that they would have been hit really hard by recessions even in the absence of NAFTA, and they had strong ties to the US even before NAFTA, so they would still be hit by domestic downturn within the United States. Then they tell you that economic downturn and poverty reduction is a lot slower in Mexico than it is in the rest of Latin America. We say that this happened because Mexico experienced the peso crisis, but we say two things. Number one, the peso crisis would have spilled over to the rest of Latin America had the US not bailed them out, and number two, growth would have been a lot worse in Mexico had they not seen the bailout. None on our case. First, he tells you that the bailout did not happen because of NAFTA, but this is not true. Blecker claims that NAFTA forced Mexico to devalue the peso, but Mexico would have had to devalue it anyway. This is because they pegged the value of the peso to the American dollar in 1988 before NAFTA talks even started, and then experienced political violence in 1994 that caused investors to flee the region out of fear. Because the value of the peso was pegged, it was overvalued compared to what investors saw, which means that devaluation would have happened in either world, not linked to NAFTA, but NAFTA was the only way in which we saw a solution.
Can you time?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. All right, you ready? Let's go. Okay. Let's start time now. Okay, so you talk about how the peso crisis would have spilled over to the rest of the world, right?
Right.
So doesn't America have an interest in preventing a global recession either way?
So we would say that the reason they would not have, I would say that of course the US has an interest in preventing a global recession, but I would say that they empirically have not stepped in to intervene in countries that they did not have dense trade ties with,
Okay.
like Argentina when they experienced the peso
So let's talk about that though, right? Because in 1982, when Mexico was south of their border, they did. But really what I was about to ask you about, right, is in first Crossfire, Chris told Ishan that the reason they wouldn't have is because there was no risk of a global recession without NAFTA. So why are you trying to solve a problem that NAFTA created?
So we would say that there definitely would have been a risk of a global recession absent NAFTA.
So then you disagree with what Chris said in first Crossfire?
No, we would say, no, I think you're misunderstanding our argument. Our argument is that if the peso crisis had not been, if like the Mexico had not been bailed out during the peso crisis, there would have been a global economic crisis. I do not think that that is the case with other countries that have been in recession because they do not have the same number of like economic linkages that Mexico does to the rest
We'll
of the
get back to this in a second, but I think it's your turn for your question.
Sure. So when you talk about the fact that like volatility increased in Mexico after NAFTA, why is that the case?
Volatility increased?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're doing comparative analysis. So you talk about how in Mexico volatility dropped by 40%. Ishan's going to come up here and tell you that we agree because most countries that open up to trade gradually see reductions in volatility. But the rest of Latin America saw far greater reductions in volatility than Mexico, which is why all of the recessions were worse for Mexico than them.
I would say that, number one, the reason why Mexico experiences worse recessions than the rest of Latin America is because it's so liberalized. It has free trade agreements with so many countries. So of course it will be impacted more frequently and severely. But specifically the dense linkages to the U.S. forged by NAFTA are the uniqueness for our case.
So our argument is that while all of the countries in Latin America are highly liberalized, NAFTA is what uniquely took away the regulations on that liberalization, which is why it's worse. But can I have a question?
Go ahead.
You talk about how if they didn't bail them out, they would go like Argentina, and poverty in Argentina doubled, right? So Argentina and Brazil both saw worse recessions, and both of them were not bailed out, and we agree that these things happen. But in the long term, through gradual liberalization, what happened to those countries relative to Mexico?
So the problem is that we would say that gradual liberalization would not have been a sustainable possibility for Mexico.
We understand that response, but I'm talking particularly about if we won that point, what did happen to Argentina and Brazil without an American bailout?
I'm not going to entertain that because I don't think that that point has like a valid premise in the round. So I would say,
I mean, we think it does, which is why I asked.
Well, I mean, once you if you win that argument and properly respond to the responses I put on your case,
the correct
then we
answer
can weigh
is
that in
that
summary.
they outperformed Mexico by a factor of 2 and cut poverty by a third.
So I would say that the reason why that happened was because they were not affected by the tequila crisis, specifically because the U.S. bailed them out and that crisis didn't spread to the rest of Latin America.
Argentina was not bailed out.
All right. Is everyone good? starts on their contention 2, moves to our case. All right? The first key extension on their contention 2 comes from Harvard, telling you that we have the same amount of trade in either world. The two differences are, one, we have it through gradual pace. The second difference is that we maintain regulations to protect domestic industries. Regulations go all out on day one in a pro world. I'll implicate that later. The second thing to extend comes to the University of Houston. This is really important because it tells us that Mexico was the #1 model for development pre-NAFTA in 1993. Now, this is important because that means that influxes in investor capital would have been able to continue in future governmental generations. The third is the CPS turn, telling you that in reality, because of NAFTA, the change in investment was to FPI, foreign portfolio investment, which are things like stocks, which are way more volatile. But a key concession we get is that the only reason a global crisis was even possible was because of NAFTA happening in the first place. We argue that that risk is not good because of the clean extension of the Neely card, that Mexico would have been able to stabilize its economy if the NAFTA dependence was not created. She just says that political violence was also a factor. But Devesh takes this into account, and our card is very specific in saying that NAFTA compromised 50% of the devaluation, taking this into account. More specifically, on our case, a couple of things. The first thing that she says is that we didn't have sustainable momentums, and we would have caused a global crisis. The HBR card is very specific here because of things like she says, like signing on to other free trade agreements. Like in 1988, the GATT, we were already contractually locked, not we, Mexico was contractually locked into reforms that would have continued. Then she says, that we have renegotiations happening right now. One, she doesn't prove probability, but second, the damage is already done, where we have 5 million or tens of millions of people displaced. On our point about protecting domestic industry, she says that NAFTA put stipulations that we could grow, but because we became dependent on these foreign investors, we could not rely on these stipulations, and they were forced to ignore them. Then she says prices went down because of our warrant, but our point is that short-term prices went down, but the World Trade Organization specifically tells you when accounting for monopolization long-term in 97% of the agricultural market, prices went up by 38%. The impact is that poverty was reduced by 1/3 in other Latin American countries that use this same type of development path. But Mexico had nothing. They pushed tens of millions of people into poverty per recession just because of foreign dependence, and it's for these reasons that I strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
So for the judges, it's going to start off on their first contention. Is everyone ready? You guys? Cool. Let's start off with their first contention. Remember the second response from Orme, which says that the GDP growth that they talk about, which was so good, would be difficult to sustain without NAFTA because they needed NAFTA to actually engage in the international market and to become integrated internationally. That's going to be important later. But then on their evidence about destroying of domestic industries, we say from Letterman that NAFTA included provisions to protect the agricultural industry, which is the only industry they talk about. Don't let them talk about more industries in Final Focus. Then they say that it was dependent and that the dependency was the only reason why they were able to allow for the agricultural industry to be destroyed. But this doesn't make sense because they say they want a gradual approach. Letterman says that NAFTA included provisions to protect the agricultural industry and gradually reduce tariffs. That means that it is not the fault of U.S. participation in NAFTA that destroyed these industries, it's rather the fault of Mexican participation in NAFTA that destroyed these industries because they did it all on their own. Now let's go into our second contention about incentivizing a U.S. bailout. The main response here that they extend comes from Neely, which explains that the reason that they started the bailout and the peso crisis was because of U.S. dependency, and that they would have been able to recover from it on their own. Their evidence does not say that Mexico was able to recover from the peso crisis, and clearly this isn't the case, because the Puig evidence at the bottom of our case says that Argentina had a similar peso crisis, but did not have the close economic linkages forged to the United States because of NAFTA. And when they had that peso crisis and they didn't have the U.S. to bail them out with billions of dollars, their poverty rate doubled. They don't actually give you a quantified impact about how much poverty would have decreased through their gradual approach, or what even their gradual approach would have even meant, because we say that NAFTA included those provisions for that gradual approach. But we say from the Humphrey evidence that the devaluation of the peso that started in 1988, years before NAFTA talks even began, that hurt NAFTA, and the Clinton had to act. And the Lacuna evidence, which explains that the U.S. had no choice but to bail out Mexico or suffer the economic chaos itself. They only impact to the Mexican development being slowed. But we say from the Vasquez evidence that the U.S. bailout prevented the impact of a global financial crisis that would have impacted a lot more countries in Mexico. That means we outweigh on scope.
Okay, let's start. Okay. So you talk about how there would have been a global crisis, right? So my question is, did the 2008 global recession wipe out all of the improvements in living standards that we saw for developing countries both beforehand and after?
There wasn't evidence read in the round about that.
I'm just asking you, from a historical
the
perspective.
2008 recession was bad, right? But we say in the evidence and the response that doesn't get responded to, which Eden brings up in the rebuttal, says that because Mexico had free trade agreements with so many other countries, they still would have probably been hit as hard, if not harder, without NAFTA.
Yeah, but
right?
those agreements were all
question?
signed after NAFTA.
Can we ask
My
a question?
question
Wait,
wasn't
there's no
answered.
That was
though.
responded to.
It's
They were
Grand
able to
Crossfire.
maintain regulations.
Wait.
It's Grand Cross, and there was no argument made in the round
okay,
that
this is not a new
NAFTA is
argument.
the reason for those other free trade agreements. And I would also add that a lot of those
was
free trade
responded
agreements were predated NAFTA. So it is the case that Mexico still would have had a lot of linkages to other
Right.
countries throughout the world.
To clarify,
even if NAFTA did
we're not
exist.
trying to make a new response. All
Okay.
we're asking you is that when we compare the impact of 25 years of development versus one recession that could have been
Okay.
really bad, we would argue that those recessions, we still recover from them, and the development in the long term still benefits the world.
Let's talk about the recovery process. So Argentina, is its growth higher than Mexico's or lower than Mexico's?
Higher by a factor of 2.
No, it is not.
Yeah, it is as of this year, yeah.
No, okay. Well, as of 2017, it's lower, right?
It's
and
not lo- it's
over
not lower.
1994 to 2017, its per capita GDP growth per year has actually less than Mexico's, right? So
No.
that's the comparative,
Wait,
right?
to
Argentina
clarify-
had a peso crisis without a U.S. bailout. Their poverty rate more than doubled, and their growth slowed more than Mexico's. But
if
we
can
have a
clarif-
question?
Well, I mean, you've just said a lot of things. I wanted
But-
to respond.
okay,
what I
so
would say
respond and then I'll
is
have a
that actually those numbers about low growth were only in the years after Argentina's recession. On their broad trend,
Clearly.
not only has their growth been higher, but even if we neglect growth, their poverty reduction has been several times higher than Mexico's.
No,
so even
Argentina
in your worst case
specifically is
example,
not no. Argentina's
it doubled in the
poverty
first couple
rate
of years
is not
after
decreasing.
NAFTA.
We read you the evidence that Mexico went from the #1 developing model to post-NAFTA 18th out of 20.
Right, and our argument explains why that happens, because we say that because
Because of one
it
peso
experienced experienced the
crisis?
peso crisis. That's why they had lower
Really?
development than the rest of Latin America.
So-
But we would
Does that
say
make a lot
that the
of
peso
sense?
crisis without the bailout would have been a lot worse and would have caused even lower rates of poverty reduction and even lower rates of growth. And number two, that same impact would have been seen across Latin America had the U.S. bailout not occurred.
Other
which
Latin
our evidence
American
specifically
countries
says
were
happened
hit by
because of
recession.
Can we
NAFTA.
have a
Correct.
question? Can we have a
Like,
question?
you guys
about,
can have a
like, your
question.
narrative, right? So, how much slower would have the Mexican economy liberalized without NAFTA?
Right. So what we tell you is that while the tariffs were going away gradually under NAFTA, all of the protections for investment and all of the regulations were wiped out overnight.
Wait,
so
in
we would
what
argue that
industries,
none of
though?
that would have
'Cause
happened.
The only industry that you talk about is the agricultural industry.
That's our
It's not
example, but we
responsive to
tell
the
you
evidence,
that on
which
the whole
explains that they
regulations
had provisions in the agricultural
Yeah,
industry
those are
to
tariffs.
crowd out multinational
Right.
corporations,
Again,
but the
Chris-
Mexican government
Yeah.
did not follow these provisions.
As
so
I
it's
said,
not U.S.
those are
participation
tariffs,
in
those are
NAFTA.
not regulations, and we point out that the only reason they went away was because American hedge funds threatened them and put pressure under NAFTA.
CPS.
It's fine. What happened?
I told you to extend something.
Were we still on the
This
mic?
mic is on.
Oh, we're still on the mic. Yo, turn us
Still
down,
talking
fam.
to people.
Hello? Are you guys good now? Yeah, okay. Cool, we made it. All right, this is my last speech ever, so let's do it. Time starts. Beginning with the issue of recessions, what we tell you is a couple of things. First, both of us agree that trade would have been the same with or without NAFTA. They themselves talk about other agreements that were signed, so it doesn't make a lot of sense when they say that NAFTA locked in the increase in trade. Ishan told you in 1988, Mexico signed onto the GATT, which was a binding agreement that would have made them increase trade in either world. The difference was, first, you got rid of the protections for the domestic industries. It happened a lot faster. But second, you got rid of regulation under NAFTA, which is going to be the crucial reason why you sign your ballot for the con. Let's deal with the specific impact they talk about. They tell you that when you have an American bailout and more investment, they recover from 94. We tell you that, first of all, by 1993, they were already leading Latin America, so they did not need this American investment. And more importantly, the type of investment changed to being 5 times more volatile under NAFTA. So on the whole, the odds of a recession increased. We tell you that the reason this recession happened was, first, by becoming dependent on American investment. Under NAFTA, when America pulled out, the peso fell an additional 50%. But second, they say that Mexico could not have recovered on their own, and we agree. What our evidence tells you is that without NAFTA, Mexico could have stopped it before it even started, but under NAFTA, they had no ability to do so. They are solving a problem that they only created. At the end of the day, even if you buy that Argentina and other countries have hit recessions, we say 2 things. 1, America has bailed out Mexico even before free trade agreements, so you don't need NAFTA. But 2, the rest of Latin America have all seen similar recessions, and all of them, despite global financial crises alike, have bounced back. They've been hit less hard, and they have reduced poverty by 1/3 while growing twice as fast. We showed that a recession is not the end-all be-all. Finally, on our case, the only 2 things they say is that we locked in increasing free trade, and we respond to this by showing you that it was already locked in. They tell you that they had the ability to protect their corn industry, and even if that's true, regulations on the whole still went away, which is why, on balance, it was a net job destroyer. On balance, every recession hit Mexico harder than the rest of Latin America, and on balance, every Latin American country cut poverty by 1/3, while Mexico made no progress whatsoever. On balance, you're voting con. Yeah.
When everyone's ready. Weisborough explains that all the growth that they talk about happened during protectionism. But second of all, Orme explains that without NAFTA, the growth that they talk about would not have been sustainable. They say that Mexico was already involved in the gap, but they dropped the warrant behind the Orme evidence, which they never interact with throughout the round. He explains that the party that was in power faced serious opposition during that election, the election that year, which threatened to undo all of the progress on liberalization. That's why they needed new momentum. They needed NAFTA to be signed to sustain the growth that was seen. You would not have seen the increase in GDP and the growth they talk talked about absent NAFTA. Don't let them wiggle around and go for the general idea of their contention. The only regulation that they talked about in case and throughout the round is on agriculture. That's why the Liederman evidence is the round-losing piece of evidence for them. They ignore the fact that the tariffs were possible under NAFTA, specifically on the agricultural industry, but Mexico chose not to use them. This means that U.S. participation is not the reason why all of their impacts are occurring. It's the Mexican government's failure to properly implement NAFTA positions that they were offered, which means that it's not the case that the affirmative is actually the reason for these impacts. It's not because of American participation. It's specifically because of the Mexican government, and NAFTA included provisions that could have prevented this from happening. But moreover, they say, on recessions, we tell you that Mexico has free trade agreements with 46 other countries, so they would have seen recessionary impacts even without NAFTA. The place where you vote for us is off of the bailout. They tell you that recession creates dependency, but it's not that they could recover on their own. Their evidence doesn't say that. In Argentina, without the bailout, the poverty doubled. They say that poverty was reduced in other Latin American countries, not in the ones that had a peso crisis without a bailout, like Argentina, where poverty doubled. But second, Humphrey explains that devaluation happened years before talks began. It was not because of NAFTA, but Lacuna specifically finds that the U.S. had no choice but to bail out Mexico, specifically because of the linkages caused by NAFTA. We outweigh on strength of link because all of their arguments are reliant upon Mexican government's failure to properly implement NAFTA, but the peso crisis was caused by NAFTA. The previous bailouts were not because of the United States, but they experienced massive capital flight, specifically because of the depreciation that was already on trend from happening. As per the Blecker evidence, the evidence that we read specifically isolates for NAFTA as the reason why we saw the bailout and the reasons why Mexico didn't see an increase in poverty.